Hello and welcome to another video from the Activism, Influencing and Change program with me, Tom Kirk. Today we're going to talk about constructing or identifying problems with which to begin or kick off your influencing design process. As we often argue and will do in other videos, an influencing strategy design can often be seen as a game of two halves. The first half consists of identifying a problem to work on, unpicking the system that's producing it, and seeking out those stakeholders who you might engage with plausible influencing tactics to make a change. To get into that, we're going to begin by looking at three types of problems that activists often face. We're going to call them simple, complicated, and wicked problems, and we're going to argue that they differ in their level of complexity, specifically the nature of the problem and whether there's agreement over its solutions, and the ability for stakeholders who might be able to make change to cooperate over that solution. We're then going to look at what makes for a good influencing problem to kick off your design processes. We're going to argue that that problem should be neither too abstract, too great, or too structural, nor should it be too specific and focused, and it really shouldn't simply include your preferred solution to that problem. Somewhere in the middle allows activists to engage in this analysis process and unpick the system and think outside the box in terms of the tactics that they might come up with. We're going to end by talking about how you might begin constructing that problem with which to kick off your strategy design process. So a categorization of different types of problems can help us think about those that activists might want to address. The three categories we're going to look at in the next slides are tame, complicated, and wicked problems. Each differs in their level of complexity, both in terms of defining the nature of the problem and its solutions, and in the ability or prospects of cooperation amongst the stakeholders that might be involved in addressing that problem. Turning first to tame problems, they can be understood as problems that are well known, easily defined. Everyone agrees, all the stakeholders agree that they are problems to begin with, and there's broad knowledge of the system that is producing that problem and why it's a problem. At the same time with tame problems, there's also broad agreement among stakeholders that over the solution to those problems, and they're willing to cooperate. In this case, we might say that the solution to the problem is one of best practice, transferring those solutions from one context or one system to another. Examples of tame problems might be solving maths equations, the need to reset a password that's been compromised, or even something like building a bridge, which might seem complicated, but there's broad agreement on the best practices for building bridges, and generally stakeholders are willing to cooperate over the building of bridges in any given political system, so to speak. Moving up a level of complexity, we turn to complicated problems now. A bit like their tame cousins, complicated problems are often well recognized as problems and clearly defined, with everyone agreeing that there is an issue that needs to be worked on. However, where they differ is that the stakeholders in that system and those who might be able to work on that problem often have varying levels of knowledge about the system that's actually producing it. Some of them might be very familiar with particular parts of that system, particular processes and feedback loops, whereas other stakeholders have knowledge of different parts of the system. There you can see there's a real need for activists perhaps to bring those stakeholders together to combine their knowledge. Likewise, with complicated problems, there's often some disagreement about the best solution to the problem. This could be because it's a technically challenging problem, or there's some kind of political debate about that solution. In this case, we might say that good practice is needed, with stakeholders needing to come together to debate and learn from one another about what might be good practice. Examples of complicated problems might include supply chains. For instance, in the picture, there might be a humanitarian supply chain. They might include protections for whistleblowers, which are inherently political and controversial problems to address, or there might be something that is particularly technically difficult, like getting to the mast. These are all complicated problems with multiple stakeholders, complex and hard to completely know systems producing them, where people need to be brought together, perhaps by activists, debates need to be had, and pathways to their solution charted. Turning now to the highest level of complexity, we find wicked problems. These are the kinds of problems that activists often want to address or are facing in the systems in which they work. Wicked problems are often highly contested amongst stakeholders, with some not even agreeing that the problems are problems themselves, and others arguing over how best to define those problems. The systems that produce them often have a large amount of stakeholders with competing interests or values. Some of them might be benefiting from the status quos that produce those wicked problems, while others might be severely affected by the problems themselves. The solutions to wicked problems are sometimes unknown, or if they are, there might be disagreement about which possible solutions are the best to work towards. At the same time, what success in solving or addressing those problems looks like might be unknown or highly debated amongst those stakeholders. There's severe cooperation challenges between those stakeholders, and there's a multiple interdependent and interconnected elements producing those problems. Examples of wicked problems might be police brutality in democracies in the global north. They might be the climate change and the systems that are producing it. Or there might be something like raising a child. If we think when we're raising a child, there's multiple variables and feedback loops. It's really hard to know as parents what the solution to producing a great child is. It really is a case of trial and error in many cases. If we think about wicked problems, you can start to see the need for activists. Activists are needed at all stages, from raising awareness and defining that problem to bringing stakeholders together to agree about proposed solutions and align their values and interests, and even to sometimes declare when success might be achieved or when that problem might be effectively resolved. One of the first steps to designing a plausible or intentional influencing strategy is to define the problem that you want to work on. A way to go about this is to first understand what are bad influencing problems or bad places to start. We'd argue that one category of bad influencing problem are problems that are too big. These are problems that are abstract, often global in nature, and that don't have easy entry points or easily recognizable entry points for influencing. This is often because the system producing those problems is too big or unclear, and that these types of problems can lead to a everything must change in order for any progress to be made or mindset. Examples of these types of problems can be the patriarchy, capitalism, inequality, or global climate change. We might want to work on all of these problems, but starting at this level can lead to analysis paralysis and a lot of frustration as you realize that it's politically unfeasible for everything that produces those problems to change. Another type of bad problem to start with are problems that are too narrow, too focused, and those that include your preferred solution. For example, the lack of a law on X, or there's not enough teachers. These are all solutions, they're not really problems. The issue with starting at this level of analysis is not only that you are closing down alternative solutions to the problem, they also close down that ability to step back and get to grips with the system producing that problem in order to think outside of your usual box and to bring in alternative voices that have different perspectives on the problem and the solution and the possible solutions to it. So what constitutes a good problem for those looking to design a plausible or intentional influencing strategy? We'd argue that good influencing problems sit somewhere in between the two types of bad problems discussed in the previous slide. They're neither too large that we can't begin to analyze the system producing them, or they mean that everything must change in order to make progress. Neither are they so focused that they contain your preferred solution to the problem. A good influencing problem allows for a process of analysis, often involving multiple stakeholders, discussing the system and producing it and identifying entry points for change. There's other characteristics that are important to good problems. Generally, The process of arriving at a good influencing problem should involve those affected by it, involve conversations with them. There's a principle among activists, nothing about us without us, and this refers to the fact that any problem definition, and especially any proposed solution, should be co-identified and co-designed with those affected by the problems. A good problem should also be produced by a system that is amenable to analysis. We should be able to, even if we don't know all of the constituent parts of that system, we should be able to talk in generality or in general terms about the system producing the problem and engage in a process of analysing it with our allies and the stakeholders affected by that problem. A good influencing problem will lead to a series of tactics that can be arranged in a sequence in order to begin to make change. Perhaps most importantly, a good influencing problem should require you as an activist to influence those with power to make change about that problem. And that influencing should be essentially asking those in power to stop something they're doing which you disagree with or is leading to bad outcomes, to perhaps act differently, maybe implement a policy in a new way, and to do something differently, perhaps to create a new law or to treat an affected population group in a different way. Influencing problems are about changing the balance of power and often about getting those with the power to make change in that system to act. When activists are deciding on how to define a problem that they want to work on, it can help to ask themselves a series of really basic questions. These questions can help them to avoid arriving at a problem that's either too large or abstract or that's too focused and contains their preferred solution. The goal is to arrive at a definition of the problem that allows for further analysis steps, systems analysis, stakeholder mapping, identifying points of entry and converting them into smart tasks. So these questions are pretty basic. They begin with asking yourself why this problem matters and who it matters to. Who's affected by this problem, which particular population groups, or perhaps which ecosystems or which countries or which regions. Next, you might ask yourself, well, who needs to care about this problem? Who already cares about it and whose awareness needs to be raised? Who needs to realize the priority that this problem should be? Really importantly, activists must also begin to think to themselves, well, what are the boundaries of the system producing this problem? In later videos, we'll talk more about systems analysis, but it's important that problems have roughly definable boundaries to allow for that analysis process that activists have to engage in. And then lastly, activists should ask themselves, how would the world look differently if this problem is successfully resolved? This is really important to give a vision of change to help orientate that design process.